time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Michael Withey. Michael Withey is a Seattle-based public interest and human rights attorney and organizer of the recent Human Rights Abuses Expose the Cover-Ups conference that was held October 14th here in Seattle. He is also author of the forthcoming book, Summary Execution, The Political Assassinations of Silme, Domingo, and Viernes. Michael, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Mike.
So start out, tell us, what was your motivation in putting together the recent Human Rights Abuses Conference?
Well, in working on the Domingo and Viernes book, which we were able to win a huge human rights victory against the Marcos regime for the murder of two anti-Marcos union activists in Seattle, we realized that a lot of the human rights cases, both in the United States and around the world, were proceeding forward without a common kind of thread of what is the best strategies for winning these cases. Individual organizations like the Center for Constitutional Rights or Center for Justice and Accountability were doing great work. But in reaching out to them, I discovered that they felt it was important to kind of regroup our forces and figure out where do we go from here, what are the strategies that have been successful, and how have these organizations exposed the cover-ups and defeated the cover-ups that were involved. Many times, in 10, 20, 30 years, you have to keep fighting, and we wanted to bring people together and learn the lessons from each other.
Well, in those organizations that have been defeating efforts to bring these cases to light tend to be state actors, don't they?
Well, some of them are. The United Nations is involved. Of course, the United States has, Department of Justice bringing cases involving like the Ferguson situation with mass incarceration. But basically, we've been able to recognize that in many cases, the United States government has been part of the cover-up. For instance, the human rights case that the University of Washington brought against the Central Intelligence Agency. Angelina Godoy is litigating a case in order to get documents from the CIA involved with the El Salvadorian death squads that murdered so many people in the 1970s. Well, you would think that our government would want to assist that effort, but instead, they initially asserted a kind of a heinous doctrine called the Glomar Explorer. It happened to have something to do with Howard Hughes' efforts to find a Soviet sub. That's neither here nor there, but Angelina's Human Rights Center brought this case, and the day they filed the lawsuit, Brennan was up, the head of the CIA was up on the UW campus, and her office was broken into that evening. There was no sign of entry, but her computer and her hard drive were stolen. And when I went up and met with her about it, I said, these are kinds of things that look like cover-ups. This look like maybe the El Salvadorians wanted to get your computer and find out what you had. And the best way of confronting these kinds of cover-ups, these kinds of actions, is to expose it, as to hold a conference, have people talk about it, have people speak on it. And that's what, in part, what our motivation was to give the Center for Human Rights at UW an airing. The U.S. government asserted this Glomar Explorer, which said we can neither confirm nor deny that we do or do not have documents. Well, how helpful is that? So she's been successful in overcoming that, but the U.S. government was saying, we don't even want to tell you anything. And, when it comes to murdering people abroad, where the U.S. government was involved in efforts to arm the El Salvadorian military and the military intelligence, the people going into the countryside to root out people that they thought might be against the government, we need the help of the U.S. government, not the resistance of it. So that was an important part of this conference.
Yeah, I believe it seems pretty clear the U.S. government was complicit in supporting both the right-wing government, Arena, at the time, as well as later documents show that it knew full well what the paramilitary groups like Roberto D'Aubuisson were doing.
Well, exactly. And another example is that after 40-some years, the U.S. government finally released documents from the CIA that indicated that they believed that General Augusto Pinochet was behind the assassination of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffett in D.C. in 1976. Well, why does it take 40 years for the U.S. government to provide to the victims of the Chilean junta, the murdered 50, 60,000 people in the stadium, including the husband of a woman who came, Joyce Horman came, and her husband, Charles Horman, was murdered along with Frank Tarugi. It was made into a movie called Missing, a great movie. But gee whiz, the United States government knew who was involved in those assassinations, but didn't support the people, that were the victims and the survivors that were murdered. So, it's just George Shultz, the Secretary of State under Reagan, had those documents in the 1980s and could have released them, but they didn't. It took the Obama administration through John Kerry to finally present them to the present duly elected government of Chile. Well, it shouldn't take 45 years to expose, an assassination that was on our streets in Washington, D.C. in Sheridan Square. And Orlando Letelier and his assistant Ronnie Moffett were assassinated by a car bomb that was done at the behest of the Chilean junta, and Pinochet was behind it. And they brought a case and they litigated that for years and years, and got essentially no help from the U.S. government in solving a murder that took place here. Orlando Letelier was the former ambassador from the Chilean government under Salvador Allende, the duly elected socialist government of Chile. He was the ambassador to the U.S., and after the coup took over, he was very active in exposing the coup. So we are very pleased to have John Dingus, who wrote the book Assassination on Embassy Row and the Operation Condor, which was Condor was Pinochet's way of exporting his right-wing military dictatorship to other countries and using spies and military intelligence agents to go after the left and people's movements in the Southern Cone in Chile. So John Dingus was very able in this conference to expose how slow it is the United States has been to help people that have run afoul of foreign governments. And in this case, including the work that we've been doing around Silme, Domingo, and Viernes.
Your conference had an amazing lineup of people. And again, you mentioned Joyce Horman. I believe in the statement that she made there at the conference, she said that 43 years later, she is still seeking the U.S. government to open an investigation into U.S. naval personnel that were involved in the disappearance of her husband. Is that right?
Yeah, Ray Davis was a U.S. naval captain who transported Charles Horman from the south of Chile. He was down at Vina del Mar and brought him back to Santiago, where, of course, he was murdered, unfortunately, and along with Frank Tarugi. These were journalists, filmmakers that were there to document what was going on in Chile. Well, the U.S. Navy then decided to provide to the Chilean junta derogatory information saying that these guys were leftists, and that's really kind of all it took. I think what's important about what Vince Warren said, Vince is the Center for Constitutional Rights executive director. He's the guy who won the stop and frisk case against the New York Police Department. I mean, basically, the New York Police decided some time ago that they wanted to pass a regulation called stop and frisk that said whenever we want to stop and frisk a black person, then we have the authority to do it without any reason whatsoever. And that's basically what happened in New York. Well, that's unconstitutional, and the court found it was unconstitutional. Recently, the mayor of New York, de Blasio, has stopped the appeal of that case and said, okay, we're not going to do stop and frisk anymore. Vince's theme was first of all, he says, when you bring together activists, attorneys, and storytellers, you can change the world. I think that was a great theme for this conference because that's who we had there. We had activists, and a whole activist panel. We had attorneys, including myself, and then we had storytellers like John Dingus, and we had Eric Nalder, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist from Seattle. And then the twin pillars of this work are transparency and accountability, and those two go together. Without transparency, there can be no accountability, but finding out who killed who, isn't enough. We have to bring them to justice, and that's what we're doing and trying to do in the Domingo Viernes case. But so Vince was a great keynote speaker, and we were able to establish kind of the framework for what we were operating on to expand the definition of human rights to include the use of the criminal justice system in this country to oppress people of color, not only in low-level encounters with the police, but in the kind of systemic way that the Ferguson Police Department used poor people and people of color to basically fund their police department by imposing ridiculous fines and citations and traffic stops on people. So now that it's exposed, everybody knows, well, it's not just Ferguson. So that was one of the topics we dealt with.
Another pair of speakers that you had come up all the way from Mexico were two of the parents of the 43 disappeared students from Mexico. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, in 2014, 44 students commandeered a bus, camiones, that was used to take the students to a demonstration in Ciudad de Mexico in Mexico City. On the way out of town, the caravan, the bus was stopped, and there was gunfire exchange. One student was found killed, but 43 were disappeared, and the local authorities claimed that this was a drug cartel, mafia kind of operation that was used to kill these students, and that they had been murdered and then burned in a field. And there wasn't any, so the investigators went to the field and there wasn't any evidence of it, and everybody was kind of going, well, wait a minute, where did these people go? You must know. Now, sometimes in the local governments are in cahoots with the mafia or the drug lords, and so the people, the affected parents, of these male students, they were all male, and they were all at a college for teachers, if you believe that. This is the future educators of Mexico that were murdered, or we don't call them murdered, we call them disappeared, because they may still be alive. So they've mounted a huge international effort to get to the bottom of it. The Mexican government has been hard-pressed because they've continued to give false cover stories about how this happened. And they brought in an international commission of jurists, 5 jurists from the Organization of American States, who basically went in, tried to investigate, hired experts to look at the forensic evidence, and had to leave basically because they were operating under intolerable conditions. The Mexican government made it very difficult for them to finish their work. They wrote a 635-page analysis saying we've been blocked in our attempts to get to the bottom of this. So there's a caravan going around the United States right now. I went to hear the mothers of some of the students Thursday night down at South. They were brought here by the Legacy of Equality Leadership and Organization, LELO, a great organization that was one of our partners. And Ricardo Ortega from that organization has helped organize this caravan around the country. Huge crowds and huge attendance in Los Angeles and up and down the coast, and there was a good crowd there Thursday night and Friday night. So we're hoping to give voice to the parents of the students from Mexico in order to bring hard pressure on the Mexican government to get to the bottom of what happened to those students.
One of the leaders at LELO is also the sister of one of the people in your case, in your book. Can you talk about the Domingo Viernes case?
Yeah, Cindy Domingo was the sister of Silme Domingo, and she's was the national coordinator for the Committee for Justice for Domingo and Viernes, and I was their lead counsel. Jean and Silme were murdered on June 1st, 1981. Hitmen from the Tucson gang broke into their union hall, killed Jean instantly, and with 4 .45 caliber bullet holes in him, shot by the hitmen, was able to get out of the union hall and hail down a fireman and name Ramil and Galoy, the Tucson gang members who killed them. So it was made to look like a dispute over dispatch about who was going to be dispatched from the cannery workers local that Jean and Silme worked for. But once we got involved, and Jean and Silme were very good friends of mine, we realized there were greater interests at stake, including the head of the union, who happened to be an ardent pro-Marcos man named Tony Barruso. Well, a month later, in addition to having Ramil and Galoy arrested, Barruso's gun was discovered to be the murder weapon. It was a MAC-10 .45 caliber execution piece. So we went into the prosecutor's office and says, okay, great, well, you got the hitmen, Silme named them. There was a getaway car driver that was the head of the gang, Tony Dictato. He got charged, and then there was a decoy guy named Boy Pillai, and Boy Pillai kind of skipped town. Well, Norm Mailing at the time decided not to charge Brusso, and it was just unfathomable. We had sworn testimony that Brusso had paid the hitmen for the murders. Well, Brusso didn't need to worry about dispute over dispatch. He was president of the union. He could dispatch anybody he wanted to. So we realized there was a cover-up, and the cover-up went up to the highest levels, not only from the standpoint of the local prosecuting attorney, but then in the hitman trial, a mystery witness appeared at the 11th hour of the defense case to say, oh, I was standing across the street. I saw the whole thing happen. The two men that are on trial, they weren't the person I saw go in there and come back out with a brown paper bag. And then this guy claimed that he walked across the street and asked Silme, who was dying at the time, who shot you? And Silme said, I don't know. That's contradictory to the fireman who said that Silme named the shooters. So we said, well, who the heck is this guy? Well, it turns out he was an FBI informant. His name was Levain Malvison Forsyth. He had worked, believe it or not, for Howard Hughes. He had worked for Robert Mayhew, who was the main ex-CIA agent who the Kennedy administration used to contact the mafia to kill Fidel Castro. That's who this guy, in his deposition, claimed to have worked for. You know, and he wrote up a report that said Silme didn't know who shot him. Well, that was a major cover-up when you start somehow someone knew that these murders were going to happen and sent him there. He said his modus operandi was to get a call and be told, go to stand in a particular location, go to a particular restaurant, observe what happened, and write a report. So in his deposition, I was able to ask him, well, what'd you do with it? Did you write a report? He said, yes. I said, what did you do with it? He says, I'm not trying real hard to remember. So that was part of the cover-up of the Domingo Viernes murders. But beyond that, Naval Intelligence was very concerned that Gene and Silme, as active anti-Marcos activists, had in fact reached out to the left in the Philippines, including the large Kilusan Mayuna, which is the May 1st movement, which is a left-led labor federation of hundreds of thousands of workers. And Gene had met with the head of that federation and brought back to the International Longshore and Warehousemen's Union Convention the stories about how they didn't have the right to organize, they didn't have the right to strike, they were getting killed on picket lines. And the ILWU, in a very brave move, passed a resolution to dispatch an investigative team to go to look into the anti-labor decrees of the Marcos regime. That, in a nutshell, was then how the murder conspiracy got hatched, which was to put a stop to the work that Gene and Silme were doing, and we were able to break up and expose that cover-up and to prove 10 years later in a court of law that Marcos had these guys killed and were awarded $15.1 million to the estates. We never did it for the money. We did it to expose Marcos and the cover-up. Now, more recently, we've brought in Freedom of Information Act requests against the FBI saying, give us all that you've got on this FBI informant. And they have 1,100 pages. 1,100 pages on this guy. We were able to take his deposition and the deposition of control agent, but we could only ask 3 questions. One, was he an FBI informant? And the guy said, yes, he was. Was he considered reliable? He said, yes, he was. And did you use him as a informant after he came to testify for the hitmen? An FBI informant testifying for the hitmen against the prosecution. And they said, yeah, we used him as an informant after he perjured himself. So we're going to get to the bottom of that. We know that he had close ties with this guy, Robert Mayhew. We know he had close ties with Paul Laxalt, who was the senator from Nevada, who was the guy who the Reagan administration used to tell Marcos his time was up. When Marcos was overthrown in 1986, we slapped a subpoena on him, and he had brought all his financial documents to figure out where all his hidden billions of dollars were. Well, in that, there was a 2-page document, which was the itemization of expenditures out of an intelligence slush fund used to pay for these murders as well as other nefarious deeds of the Marcos regime. So we were able to bring Marcos back into this case and get him. So, but the present effort, in addition to publishing summary execution, is the effort to get the FBI to give us their documents. We also brought an NSA, FOI, in other words, the National Security Agency, we believe have cables between the U.S. military, the Marcos military and U.S. officials, as to the presence of a military lieutenant colonel who came to San Francisco in May of 1981. Well, the NSA, when we asked them to provide those cables and who was that guy, gave us the Glomer Explorer exception, saying we can neither confirm or deny that we do or don't have documents. The same thing that Angelina Godoy experienced when she tried to get documents about the El Salvadorian junta. So it's an ongoing justice effort. Cindy talked about the need to build a mass organization to hammer. She did a fantastic job in building the Committee for Justice and was one of the activists who spoke at the activist convention, along with the Ayotzinapa 43. We also had a video of the Jesuit massacres in El Salvador in 1989, in which 6 Jesuit priests were brutally murdered. 2 of the survivors of that massacre were scheduled to come, but they had to return to El Salvador. But they gave us a video of those murders that was really, really very dramatic.
In addition, you also had multiple speakers, both locally and nationally, who have been working with Black Lives Matter and some of these issues that have been U.S. foreign policy are now, and actually have been for decades, if not since the beginning of the country, being imported here into the U.S.
Yeah, it's a very good point. We presented a panel which included Nikita Oliver, who is a wonderful, incredibly dynamic poet and attorney from Seattle, graduated from UW Law School. We also brought in Gerald Lenoir. Gerald headed the anti-apartheid movement in Seattle and moved down to the Bay Area. And I think he gave a very insightful analysis of why Black Lives Matter is not simply a civil rights struggle, but is actually an international human rights struggle. And you could, of course, see the kind of cover-ups that the police departments in this country have engaged in when people of color are gunned down. Fortunately, through body cams and video cams and just citizens having their cameras, we've been able now to kind of peel the onion and look at the raw nature of police violence against communities of color. So that was discussed. Vince Warren talked about the stop and frisk and some of the other cases. But, yeah, it's kind of like chickens coming home to roost, to borrow a phrase from Stokely Carmichael. You know, when we support repressive governments abroad, like as in Chile and El Salvador and the Philippines, chickens come home to roost, meaning it often brings repression in this country, the Letelier assassinations, the Domingo Viernes murders. So we need to put a stop to U.S. support for those kinds of regimes that violate people's human rights, not only because it's best for the people of those countries, but also because it's best for our communities here.
And it seems the repression manifests itself in a greater magnitude anytime that there is significant organizing. Again, going back to the Viernes Domingo case, it was when they're going to do international labor organizing, and I imagine there were ties to the fact that the U.S. had a major military base there in the Philippines as well.
Exactly. The Subic Bay was really the headquarters for the naval action in the war in Vietnam, and Marcos was pleased to have the U.S. come and launch their war from his country and supported that war himself. But the Navy was very concerned about the Union of Democratic Filipinos that Gene and Silme had been part of because they were worried about the KDP and their supporters in the Philippines turning Subic Bay into a major issue of the Filipino people, which is what happened. And naval intelligence out of Alameda got an executive order allowing them to infiltrate the Union of Democratic Filipinos and to report on people like Silme Domingo and Gene Viernes. They had an informant in the organization. So when Gene went to the Philippines in March and April before he was murdered, U.S. Naval Intelligence sent a cable to Marcos Intelligence saying Viernes was carrying with him $290,000 to provide to the anti-Marcos opposition. In fact, Gene was carrying $2,900. And that we don't think that it was about a decimal point. We think that U.S. intelligence was hand in glove with Marcos intelligence because they knew that Marcos intelligence was involved in the United States spying on anti-Marcos Filipinos. And they actually had a circular that named the spies that were here, the Philippine military officers. This is the Defense Intelligence Agency, had a circular naming them, saying they're here to monitor and operate against the anti-Marcos opposition. Well, operate against is intelligence jargon for including use of physical violence against the adherents, people who wanted peace and freedom in the Philippines. So that was a very, dramatic disclosure. And I think when people read the book, they'll realize that it took Terry Mass, the widow of Silme Domingo, and Cindy Domingo, the sister, and myself, years and years to finally get to the bottom of it. And it takes steely determination and a mass organization to do that, and one that is connected to international movements. We wouldn't have won that case against Marcos if the people of the Philippines hadn't thrown him out in 1986. So this is all part of an international effort to bring about human rights that is ongoing, and it's very important to support.
So just about a minute left. What are you hoping to do with this conference? Where are you guys going from here?
Well, the conference ended on a really high note, I think because of the quality of the speakers and the people who came. And what we did is had a session at the end of it saying, well, where do we go from here? And I think there was consensus that we wanted to continue to work this human rights network. We're going to take the video that you were very nice enough to take and the recording of the conference, and we're going to probably try to get it out to our partners. We had 20 mass organizations that were partners, ACLU, American Constitution Society, LILO, Sierra Club, Seattle Urban League. We had a lot of really great supporters in this and want to thank them. We had law firms that were sponsoring it. Jack Connolly's firm was great. He helped moderate a panel. So we're gonna continue the light that we hopefully show we brought to the issue in our ongoing work to send this a tape, videotapes of the conference to not only these organizations but their membership and supporters.
All right, and in addition to your book coming out, do you have a website people can go to?
Yeah, it's called www.michaelwithey.com. That's the website for the book, and then the website for the conference is www.exposecoverups.com. All
right. Well, with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us today.
Thanks so much, Mike. Went really well. Thanks so much.